That day, Rachel left work early to get to her country house before dark. She had inherited it from her grandmother, planning to spend her weekend there. Rachel brought lots of food and a supply of drinking water with her. Since there were virtually no stores in the village, the woman drove her old Ford a couple of kilometers on the highway and then turned onto the country road. Glancing down at her reflection in the rearview mirror, Rachel frowned. "I'm only 45 and I already look like an old woman. The face looks exhausted and those tired eyes. Although anyone would look old after 25 years of living with an alcoholic," the woman thought sadly, recalling those difficult years. They didn't have children of their own. And how could they have them if the husband was drunk all the time? Until one day, he died of alcohol intoxication. Rachel's sad thoughts were interrupted by a man that appeared on the road as if out of nowhere, and who upon seeing her, froze in fright, not knowing what to do. Out of surprise, the woman slammed on the brakes, and the car stopped a half a meter from the odd stranger. He was dressed in some kind of baggy work clothes, vaguely similar to the uniform of a construction worker or a factory worker. The man was unshaven and his eyes hollow from fatigue and lack of sleep, and looked at Rachel in a way that made her blush to the roots of her hair. When this staring contest ended, the stranger nodded and disappeared into the thickets of the dense bushes that grew in abundance on both sides of the road. Rachel breathed a sigh of relief and drove off. Soon she saw the outline of her country house. It looked like the dwelling of some fairy tale character, with the same acute angled roof and a funny chimney that sloped sideways. Seeing how the house had decayed lately, the woman sighed heavily. She was especially sad because of the fence, which was virtually lying on the ground, somehow still in one piece. Of course, Rachel understood that the house and yard needed care and a strong hand. In addition to the food in the trunk of her car, there were also some building materials, including a can of paint, some nails, and paintbrushes. She decided to start with the fence. There was still some time before the sun would set, so the woman decided not to waste it. Working with the rotten planks, the woman desperately tried to give the fence a somewhat decent look. Suddenly, Rachel heard a low male voice that made her flinch. "Let me help you. Don't be afraid. I'm a good carpenter, and I know how to work with wood." Turning her head, Rachel saw the same man she met on the road an hour ago. "If it isn't too much trouble, I will be glad to have some help, but I have nothing to give you in return. On the other hand, I can treat you to a delicious dinner." "That's more than okay, especially considering that I've been eating only apples for the past few days," the man replied, his eyes shining with joy as he got down to business. The hammer and nails worked wonders in his skillful hands. In less than an hour, the fence was as good as new, with fresh white planks instead of the rotten old ones. "Well, now we can have dinner," Rachel said, and invited the stranger into her home. The man praised the hostess' cooking skills and said that his name was Kevin. Having asked for another serving of potatoes, he added that he was in a very difficult situation, and he had nowhere to live. For some reason, Kevin was silent about the reasons that got him into this situation, avoiding any conversation on this topic. But Rachel already knew what was going on. The woman noticed the stamp with the name of the Correctional Institute imprinted on the sleeve of his overalls. It meant that Kevin had probably escaped from prison and was hiding from the headhunters that were searching for him. He's a runaway, but he's so nice. Maybe I can let him live here for a while? There's nothing to steal here, except for cobwebs and old furniture, Rachel thought, trying not to dwell on this topic. To her surprise, Kevin turned out to be an interesting companion, not what she'd expect a criminal to be like. They chatted until late at night, and the next morning, they began to weed the grass in the backyard and tidy up the yard. The weekend flew by quickly. Rachel was surprised to catch herself thinking that she hadn't had such a good time in a long while. Having decided to leave Kevin alone at her house for a week, the anxious woman was forced to return to the city, where work and a bunch of minor domestic issues were waiting for her. All this time, she couldn't let go of the thought that Kevin might not be who he pretended to be. Rachel feared that upon returning to the country house, she would find desolation and ruins there. The week dragged on for a very long time, and it seemed to Rachel that an eternity had passed since her previous visit to the village. Finally, the long-awaited Friday came, and the woman went to the country house straight from work. She was rushing to see whether everything was in order with Kevin and the property. However, when Rachel got to see her house, she couldn't believe her eyes and even thought that she might have come to the wrong address. Looking more closely, the woman realized that it was actually her house, which had been greatly transformed in the time of her absence. The facade of the building was painted in a pleasant green shade. The windows shone with cleanliness, and the creaky door awnings were oiled and opened almost silently. On top of that, a brand new wooden bench and a table appeared in the courtyard, perfect for spending time in the fresh air. Kevin made it all happen using improvised instruments and materials left by the woman during her last visit, and was now waiting for the surprised Rachel on the doorstep. Unable to control her emotions, the woman hugged her guest in joy, feeling a warm, tremulous feeling arising in her soul. They stayed up late that night, sitting at the table in front of the house. Plucking up his courage, Kevin told the woman that he was an escaped prisoner who was only 1 year away from being released. As it turned out, the man was talked into escaping by his inmates, who needed his experience and skillful hands to commit thefts in the future. But once free, their paths parted, and Kevin had to decide on his own, hiding in the bushes and woodlands. Hearing her guest's confession, Rachel hastened to assure Kevin that she, under no circumstances, would give him over to the police. Unfortunately, the woman didn't know that their conversation was unwittingly overheard by a neighbor. She was a quarrelsome, unpleasant-looking woman. Being envious of Rachel's happiness, reported to the police that an escaped criminal was hiding in the house opposite hers. That evening, they heard the sound of police sirens outside Rachel's house, and Kevin was immediately arrested. Of course, despite the fact that the man didn't resist arrest and surrendered voluntarily, he was still sentenced to a longer term. Kevin was sent to serve his sentence in the county jail, famous for its harsh rules. All this time, Rachel wrote letters to him and supported him any way she could, saying that she would definitely wait for his return. However, about 6 months before the end of his sentence, Kevin suddenly stopped getting letters from Rachel. He tied himself up with knots, puzzled over what had happened. When he finally got out, the first thing he did was go to the address indicated on the envelopes that Rachel sent him. To Kevin's surprise, an unfamiliar girl opened the door. She turned out to be the new owner of the apartment that had previously belonged to Rachel. "You must be Kevin. I've got something for you," the stranger said and left, returning a minute later with the folder in her hands. Looking at the gray-haired man, the girl added that Rachel was dead and she had nothing more to say to him. When Kevin opened the folder with trembling hands, he burst into tears. Inside the folder was Rachel's will, which stated that Kevin was to inherit her country house after her death. As it turned out, the woman knew that she was terminally ill, but she hid it well from everyone around her, wishing to be remembered as cheerful and happy. Kevin now lives in Rachel's country house. Every evening, sitting on the bench in front of the house, he sheds a tear, thinking back to how good they were together. He was done with his criminal past once and for all.